Imagine walking into a clinic, right? And you look through the observation window and you see a therapist deliberately handing a screaming child an iPad every single time that kid throws a chair across the room.
Oh, I mean, to an outsider, it looks absolutely
It
terrible.
looks like incredibly flawed therapy or, awful parenting. You are watching an adult actively reward a dangerous action.
Yeah, you're literally reinforcing danger. But to a behavior analyst, that specific, highly controlled interaction is the most precise diagnostic tool we have.
It is the ultimate tool. And uncovering how that tool works is our mission today.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you are joining us, you're probably prepping for your BCBA exam, refining your clinical practice, or you just really want a rigorous understanding of behavioral science.
Which is exactly what we are getting into today.
Yep, today we are mastering BCBA Foundation's F.6, which is designing and evaluating functional analyses.
Also known as the FA.
Exactly. We are pulling from the most recent exam literature, ethics workbooks, and some really advanced clinical frameworks today. Specifically, we're looking at the systems developed by Amethyst Therapy Services, Inc.
Oh, Amethyst Therapy Services, yeah. They focus heavily on teaching clinicians how to design FAs that are both highly ethical and, completely audit-proof.
Right, clinically elite stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So we are extracting the definitive rules for functional analysis. And hey, let me just drop a massive exam rule for you right out of the gate.
Oh, this is the golden rule for mock exams.
It really is. If you are staring down a test scenario, and the goal of the question is to determine the definitive proven function of a behavior, and functional analysis is sitting there as a multiple choice option.
You pick it, it is almost certainly the right answer.
Guaranteed.
Yeah.
Because indirect assessments like interviews or rating scale.
Or even descriptive assessments like ABC data collection.
Right. Those only generate hypotheses. They don't prove anything.
Yeah.
The FA is the only tool that provides actual experimental proof.
So let's talk about why that is. Because there is just a massive leap from tracking ABC data in a classroom to running a true FA in a clinic.
I always think of it like, if I am doing a descriptive assessment, I am essentially a wildlife photographer.
I love that analogy. Yes.
You know, I'm just sitting in the corner of the classroom with my clipboard, trying my hardest not to interfere, just logging the natural antecedents and consequences as they happen in the wild.
And the problem with the wildlife photographer approach is that the natural environment is messy. I mean, it is incredibly messy.
Too many variables.
Exactly. You have dozens of confounding variables happening all at once, like a client might rip up a worksheet. And in the exact same 3-second window, the teacher reprimands them, the kid next to them laughs, and the math demand is removed because the paper is destroyed.
So you have attention from the teacher, peer attention, and escape from the work, all happening simultaneously.
Right, and you just cannot separate those variables in a natural setting. You're just guessing. And FA solves this because it is an analog assessment.
So we pull them out of that messy classroom and bring them into a highly controlled clinic environment. It's essentially an allergy test for behavior.
Yes, an allergy test. That is the perfect way to look at it.
Instead of just guessing, like what caused a kid's rash based on a really messy week of eating random foods at school, we bring the client into a sterile clinic.
We clear the system.
Right. We clear the system and we systematically introduce specific allergens, just one by one, to see exactly what triggers the biological reaction.
And the allergens in our case are the specific establishing operations and consequences that we suspect are actually maintaining the behavior.
So we're actively testing whether the behavior is maintained by socially mediated positive reinforcement, socially mediated negative reinforcement, or automatic reinforcement.
Exactly. And we do this by setting up distinct, isolated testing conditions.
Okay, let's group these conditions by their underlying mechanisms. Let's start with socially mediated positive reinforcement.
So these are the conditions where we suspect the client is engaging in the target behavior to actually get something added to their environment.
Right. Specifically, the attention condition and the tangible condition. So how do we build these out experimentally?
Well, in the attention condition, the therapist restricts their attention. They might just sit in the room reading a book, actively ignoring the client.
Which creates an establishing operation.
Right. It creates a state of deprivation for attention. Then, when, and only when, the target behavior occurs, the therapist delivers a specific, brief magnitude of attention.
Like a mild reprimand.
Yeah.
Like, hey, please don't hit the wall.
Exactly. A reprimand, a statement of concern, whatever it is. And then the tangible condition operates on that exact same mechanical logic. We just swap out the consequence.
So instead of attention, we restrict access to a highly preferred item, like the iPad.
Right. We create the deprivation for the iPad, and the very moment the target behavior happens, we deliver the iPad for a set duration before restricting it again.
The precise delivery is really what matters here, right?
Absolutely. The consequence has to be contingent solely on the target behavior. If they engage in some different problem behavior that we aren't testing for, we just ignore it or neutrally redirect them.
Because we are isolating one specific behavioral pathway. But wait, let me push back on this for a sec,
Go for it.
because this feels entirely counterintuitive. If I am a parent or like a teacher watching this process through the window, I am watching you systematically reinforce the exact behavior we want to eliminate.
Yeah, you are.
If they hit you, you give them the iPad. Why would we ever intentionally reinforce a dangerous or disruptive behavior? Doesn't that just make the behavior stronger?
The short-term optics are undeniably challenging. It looks bad, which
Yeah.
is exactly why stakeholder buy-in is absolutely critical before you ever run an FA.
Because you are intentionally triggering it.
Yes, you are triggering and reinforcing the behavior, but without this temporary reinforcement, we are totally flying blind.
Like giving the wrong allergy medicine.
Exactly. Implementing a behavior intervention plan based on a wrong hypothesis is far more dangerous. If we guess the function is attention, and we put the behavior on extinction by ignoring it, but the true function was actually automatic reinforcement.
Then we haven't treated anything.
Nothing. We've just wasted months of clinical time and potentially allowed the behavior to become way more entrenched. The brief, controlled reinforcement during an FA is a scientific necessity.
Because it guarantees a highly effective, targeted treatment plan moving forward.
Yeah.
You have to trigger the allergy to prescribe the exact right medicine.
Perfectly said.
Okay, so if attention and tangible cover the client trying to get something, let's look at socially mediated negative reinforcement. This is the escape condition, where the client is trying to get away from something.
Right. And here, the establishing operation isn't deprivation. It is the presentation of an aversive stimulus. We usually just call this the demand condition.
So the therapist continuously presents a non-preferred task, like academic work, or a really difficult daily living skill.
Yep. And the contingent consequence here is the removal of that aversive stimulus. The moment the target behavior occurs, the therapist immediately pulls the demand.
They just take the math worksheet away, turn their back, and give a brief break.
And that break is the reinforcement. We are testing to see if the removal of the demand is actually what the client's behavior is designed to achieve.
Got it. Which leaves us with the behaviors that aren't socially mediated at all. The ones that just happen regardless of what anyone else in the room is doing.
Right. And for that, we use the alone condition. This tests for automatic reinforcement.
So the environment is just totally stripped down.
Completely. No toys, no demands, and crucially, no therapist. The client is placed in an empty room and we just observe them remotely, like through a camera or a two-way mirror.
Because if the behavior still occurs at high rates, when there is literally zero social consequence available, the behavior itself must be producing the reinforcement.
Exactly. It physically or neurologically just feels good to the client. The behavior is its own reward.
Okay, so testing these four variables: attention, tangible, escape, and alone. I mean, that means nothing unless we have a definitive baseline to compare them against, right?
Right. And that baseline is the play condition. It serves as our control.
So if the testing conditions are about introducing those behavioral allergens, the play condition is the state of perfect health.
Yes, it's an enriched environment. They have continuous, non-contingent access to highly preferred items, high-quality attention from the therapist, and absolutely zero demands placed on them.
They already have everything they could possibly want.
Exactly. So the play condition eliminates all establishing operations for problem behavior. Because nothing aversive is present and they aren't deprived of anything, the motivation to engage in problem behavior should be zero.
And if they do engage in problem behavior anyway.
Any problem behavior that happens in the play condition is just ignored or neutrally redirected.
So the play condition is our baseline heartbeat on a monitor. It should just be a low, flat line.
Right. And if we are testing different conditions, any spike above that flat baseline tells us exactly what was missing in their environment during the test.
But because we are constantly comparing data against that baseline, we really need to talk about experimental control and safety. Because when we intentionally evoke behavior, especially severe behavior, we are introducing significant risk.
Oh, absolutely. When you look at the ethics code for behavior analysts, specifically the standards surrounding assessment and intervention design, there is a very clear mandate to minimize risk.
Right, like standards 2.13 and 2.14. We have to select assessments based on scientific evidence,
Yeah.
but we can't just let an FA run wild.
No, you can't. If a client's target behavior is severe elopement or like highly damaging SIB, we face a massive ethical hurdle. You cannot let a client bolt into a busy parking lot just to see if they're doing it for attention.
Right. So what do we do? How do we test for those dangerous behaviors without letting the client get hurt?
The safety protocols require immediate intervention. In those high-risk scenarios, we utilize response blocking. We physically intervene to prevent the behavior from running its full course or causing any impact.
But wait, if we are physically blocking SIB, we aren't getting a true natural baseline of the behavior anyway.
That is exactly the issue.
Because the moment we put our hands on a client to block a strike, we've altered the environment. So from a purely scientific standpoint, a standard ABA withdrawal design is basically impossible.
Not to mention the ethical nightmare of withdrawing a working treatment while someone gets actively hurt during the A phase.
Right, so I assume this forces us to invert the experimental design entirely and just start with the treatment first.
Yes, the BAB design becomes the gold standard in these high-risk scenarios. We bypass that initial baseline phase entirely.
We just start immediately in the B phase.
Exactly. We implement the treatment package right away to get the severe behavior under control, stabilize the client, and ensure physical safety.
Okay, so that immediately satisfies the ethical requirement to minimize harm. But to prove the treatment is actually what's working like. To maintain our experimental control, we still need a comparison, right?
We do, which is why, once the behavior is fully suppressed and the client is stabilized, we briefly withdraw the treatment for the A phase.
But only briefly.
Right. We just need a tiny window of data to show that the behavior begins to trend upward again when the treatment is removed. The very moment we see that upward trend, proving our treatment was the controlling variable, we immediately reintroduce the treatment for the final B phase.
Wow, so it is just a rapid verification. It proves clinical efficacy without subjecting the client to extended periods of danger.
Exactly.
And that speaks exactly to what Amethyst Therapy Services emphasizes regarding audit-proof and ethically sound systems. You need the data, but the experimental design must flex to protect the client.
The design must always fit the clinical reality, not the other way around.
Okay, so let's transition into the data itself. Assuming we've safely navigated the assessment, we've run our sessions, and now we are looking at the output. FAs are typically graphed using a multi-element design.
RES, also known as an alternating treatments design. And the mechanics of the multi-element design are brilliant for clinical settings because you don't have to wait weeks to see a trend like you would in a reversal design.
You just rapidly alternate the conditions.
Right. You might run attention in the morning, escape right before lunch, and tangible in the afternoon.
Which generates a line graph with different data paths for each condition. So we have our low, steady baseline heartbeat, the plate condition running right along the bottom of the graph.
And when interpreting this data for an exam or in practice, we are looking for clear separation.
So if the data path for the demand condition is spiking way up at the top of the graph, and the lines for attention, tangible, and alone are all just hovering down by the plate condition at the bottom,
then the visual analysis is undeniably clear. The behavior is maintained by socially mediated negative reinforcement. The client is trying to escape the task. The data paths are highly differentiated.
But edge cases are where this gets super complicated.
Yeah.
What if the graph looks like a tangled mess of spaghetti?
Ah, the spaghetti graph.
Right. The data paths for attention, escape, play, and alone are just crisscrossing constantly at moderate to high rates across the entire graph. The data is completely undifferentiated. What does the spaghetti graph actually tell us?
So undifferentiated data points toward one of two major conclusions. The most common clinical conclusion is automatic reinforcement.
Why is that?
Because if the behavior happens at relatively similar rates regardless of the condition, even in the play condition where there are no demands and plenty of attention, it means the social environment is irrelevant to the client.
Oh, because the behavior intrinsically feels good, so they just do it everywhere, all the time.
Exactly. But there's a second possibility with undifferentiated data, and this is a really crucial nuance for exam prep. It might not be automatic reinforcement at all.
It might just be human error, like a poorly designed FA.
Yes. Specifically, a failure to discriminate. If we are rapidly alternating conditions, the client actually has to realize that the rules of the room have changed.
Oh, I see. So if the therapist walks out of an attention condition where hitting resulted in a reprimand, and then 5 minutes later starts an escape condition.
The client might still be operating under the rules of the previous session. They don't realize the contingency has shifted.
So they hit the therapist expecting attention, but instead the therapist removes the math worksheet. Now we have multiple treatment interference.
Exactly. And to prevent this, elite FA design incorporates highly salient discriminative stimuli.
Visual signals.
Right. The therapist might wear a highly visible red shirt during the attention condition and then switch to a bright blue shirt during the escape condition. Or the sessions take place in entirely different rooms.
You have to clearly signal to the client which contingency is currently active, or your data will just blur into that messy spaghetti graph.
It is so important.
That is a phenomenal detail.
Yeah.
Okay, so what if we have clear discrimination, but we see multiple lines elevated? Like both the escape line and the tangible line are spiked significantly above the play condition, but attention and alone remain flat.
Well, the visual analysis tells us the behavior serves multiple functions, because human behavior is rarely single-threaded, right?
Right.
A client might throw a chair because they want to escape a difficult math task, and simultaneously they know that getting sent to the hallway means they get to play with the preferred item they keep in their locker.
The behavior is doubly reinforced. And this is exactly where the precision of the FA pays off. Because if you only did a descriptive assessment, you might only notice the escape component.
And if you build an intervention solely around escape-like, maybe teaching them to ask for a break, the chair throwing won't stop.
Because you haven't addressed the tangible function of wanting that locker item.
You would literally be treating half the diagnosis.
Let's look at one final edge case. What happens if you run a beautifully designed FA, clear discriminative stimuli, rigorous conditions, and absolutely nothing spikes?
Just flat lines.
Yeah. Every single data path, including the test conditions, stays completely flat, just hugging the zero line right next to the play condition.
That is one of the most frustrating yet informative outcomes. If the behavior never occurs during the FA, it means your analog environment failed to capture the natural establishing operation.
The allergen wasn't present in the room.
Precisely. Meaning the specific trigger only exists in the natural environment. Perhaps the behavior is only maintained by peer attention, and your FA only tested therapist attention.
Or maybe the escape condition used math worksheets, but the client only engages in problem behavior to escape loud noises in the cafeteria.
Exactly. A flat graph means you need to redesign your hypotheses and test totally different variables.
It's a humbling reminder that the FA is only as good as the hypotheses you come into it. If you test for the wrong things, you just get really clear data about the wrong things.
Which highlights the absolute necessity of doing those preliminary, indirect, and descriptive assessments well in the first place.
You need good wildlife photography to know which allergens to test in the clinic.
Spot on.
This just breaks the entire framework wide open for me. The functional analysis isn't just a clinical tool. It is a profound shift in how we view human action.
It really is.
We aren't looking at what a person is doing anymore. The topography of the behavior, whether they are screaming, hitting, or running away, is almost secondary. The FA forces us to look entirely at the environment to understand the why.
And by isolating the environment, we completely remove the blame from the individual.
Yes.
The behavior isn't malicious. It isn't random. It is a highly logical, learned adaptation to the contingencies around them. When you map those contingencies on a multi-element graph, the invisible forces driving the behavior become visible.
So let's quickly recap the critical takeaways from today's deep dive. We started by contrasting the correlational nature of descriptive assessments with the definitive experimental control of the functional analysis.
We broke down the specific conditions by their mechanisms. Socially mediated positive reinforcement through attention and tangible conditions.
Socially mediated negative reinforcement through the escape condition.
And automatic reinforcement in the alone condition. We also established the play condition as our vital baseline heartbeat, ensuring we have a zero motivation state to compare against.
Then we navigated the strict safety requirements. We highlighted how severe behaviors necessitate response blocking, which forces us to use a BAB experimental design to maintain ethical integrity and experimental control at the same time.
And finally, we explored the nuances of visual analysis, decoding differentiated data, the variables behind a spaghetti graph, and the realities of dual functions.
It is a really dense, intricate methodology, but mastering it is what separates a good clinician from an elite one. And before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building directly on that complexity of dual functions we discussed earlier.
Oh, this is a good one.
Think about the intricate wiring of the human nervous system paired with environmental demands. If your multi-element graph reveals that a severe problem behavior is maintained by both an escape function and an automatic sensory function.
Meaning the client desperately needs to avoid the aversive task, but the topography of the problem behavior itself also physically regulates their nervous system.
Right. How do you even begin to design a replacement behavior?
It's wild to think about.
How do you find a single safe action to teach a client that simultaneously satisfies two entirely different biological and environmental needs at the exact same moment?
That is the ultimate clinical puzzle. It forces you to look way beyond simple functional communication training and really engineer a multifaceted treatment package.
And it proves exactly why having the diagnostic data from an FA is so critical. Because without knowing those two distinct functions exist, you wouldn't even know what puzzle you were trying to solve.
You'd be totally lost.
You have to be the scientist, carefully isolating the variables, before you can ever be the mechanic that fixes the engine.